in these topics. So anyway, we took this little tour expressly in preparation for this course, and one of the stops along the way was Lapwai, Idaho. If you've ever been there, you know that it's on the Indian reservation there, and it is the place where a guy by the name of Henry Spalding and his wife Eliza established a mission, a Presbyterian mission, and they lived out their career there. And indeed, there's a Presbyterian church that they established that still to this day is an operating church, and there's a wonderful group of folks that attend there, right? Probably as we're meeting here, they're there, and they have a continuous connection going back to Henry Spalding. Well, Spalding and his wife Eliza were buried in a lovely cemetery just outside of Lapwai, and this is the gravestone. I know you, unless you got better eyes than I do, you probably can't read that, you know. But it's actually the back side. The gravestone has writing on both the front side and the back side. And this is the inscription that you'll find on the back side of this gravestone. It reads, "In grateful remembrance of the heroic missionary labors of the Spaldings among the Nez Perce Indians, this memorial is erected by the state of Washington, July 1920. Coming as the morning sun over the mountains in response to the historic search of 4 Nez Perce for the white man's book of heaven, they dispelled the darkness of this benighted race and gave to them the light of life. Here now they lie among the people they loved and for whom they gave their lives, requiescant in pace, rest in peace." Well, you may detect that interesting note about 4 Nez Perce who went looking for what was commonly called at that time the white man's book of life. Now, I have to immediately say it is not the white man's book of life. We get that, right? It's the black man's book of life. It's the red man's book of life. It is God's book of life. But from the point of view of these folks at that time, that was the common way in which it was identified. And so we have the inscription to that effect. These 4 Nez Perce Indians had traveled from essentially Lapwai, Idaho. It wasn't called that at the time, but from that particular part of the country, and had made this arduous journey all across the continental United States. 4 guys, 4 Nez Perce Indians. This was 1831. They went looking for a fellow by the name of William Clark. William Clark was the superintendent of Indian Affairs for all the regions west of the Mississippi. He also happens to be the same William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Meriwether Lewis had died some years earlier. William Clark had continued his public service and was at this point working in that particular capacity. They went in and they located William Clark. Now they knew of him. I don't know if these Nez Perce had actually been there when he had arrived earlier, some 25 years earlier with Lewis, but they did come through that area. So the memory of these guys was still in the collective consciousness of the community. Whether or not they actually had met him at that time, I don't think is fully known. But anyway, they came in and they found Mr. Clark, and they said to him that they had come all of this distance, thousands of miles across the United States, very difficult, treacherous journey, but they had come for one thing: the white man's book from the Great Spirit teaching the will of God. You can imagine that Mr. Clark was taken aback, He was a government bureaucrat at this point. He didn't deem himself to be a missionary. I don't know what the state of his own heart was with respect to a Christian faith. There's no strong evidence that he had any kind of robust expression of it, at least publicly. But in any event, it did, whether it impressed him or not, or what impact it had upon him, light a bit of a fire. And across the East Coast, especially among Christian folks, there was this awakening of an idea that this was something like a Macedonian call. Here were these Native Americans out in the Pacific Northwest, which remained at this point largely unexplored by the American population, and yet they're calling out for missionaries to come with the book of life. What sent those guys back there? there's pretty strong evidence that at least a significant factor was the influence of Chief Spokane Garry, who was not at the time called by that name. That's a name that he took later, for reasons we'll talk about on another occasion. But he had just returned in 1830 from having spent 5 years at the Red River Mission in Manitoba. And he had gone there as a mid-teenage boy, about 15 years old, and while there had fully embraced the Christian faith and had then come back to become the chief of his people, the Middle Spokane, who lived right here where we live, because his father had just recently died. He came back not only with this book of life in hand, he came back fluent in English, fluent in French, a brilliant young man in every regard, a natural leader, and a robust and committed Christian. Now, they didn't have printing presses readily available, so having one Bible was a rather rare thing. It wasn't like they could say, hey, could you loan us a couple of Bibles, you know? So these Nez Perce, knowing that Chief Garry had this book, wanted their own. And that seems to be at least part of what launched them on this great trip. So in some ways, before there were any Christian missionaries around here, Chief Spokane Garry was a missionary to his own people, sparking that kind of interest in the book of life. This is a pencil sketch of what Chief Garry looked like probably when he was about 30 years old. He was an impressive man. He wasn't a big man, but he had a bearing about him that everybody noticed, a kind of natural gravitas, we might say, that gave him a leadership ability and a strong capacity to engage in mediation, which he did throughout his career between his native population and the settlers and others who were still coming in, of course, in ever-increasing numbers. And the role he played was a quite strategic one. He was always, I think it's safe to say, always inspired and informed by his biblical understanding and his Christian commitments. But I want to save more discussion of him for a later time. However, I would like to pick out one little detail of his career that I think is at least intriguing. This is sometimes called the Spokane Garry legend, but more commonly you'll hear it called the one prophecy. So it comes down in various forms. I believe I'm giving you the most widely accepted form. What I'm saying is there are variant versions of this. They all tell basically the same story. There seems to be, it's almost unavoidable to infer that there is some truth to it. And so I'm going to give you the most standard form of it. I know some of you are familiar with this, so I hope you don't mind the review. For others it may be new, but I think it's at least intriguing. The story goes like this. There were many chiefs, but 3 of them saw one prophecy. The old chief, Chief Eliium Spokanee, and Slough-Keetcha, who is ultimately Spokane Garry. They were the 3. So the old chief, his son, Eliium, and then Slough-Keetcha. The prophecy came about like this. The old chief was highly respected until the day that his favorite son accidentally died. This death hurt the old chief more than anything ever had. The chief felt his heart. It felt like a piece had been cut out. He could not stand this pain. There was no way to get away from the pain, though he tried. Finally, all he could do was cry out and to try to ease the pain. He yelled at God, "Why have you allowed my son's death? How could you be a good God and allow this to happen?" He repeated this until his tribe could stand it no longer. They didn't want the children to hear this. They worked hard to love God, and now it was even harder. They had to quiet the main chief. They went to the other chiefs and told them to challenge the old chief. Tell him to decide whether God is good or not, and whether they should go back to be like the animals again or still try to be like God. The chiefs confronted the old chief. "You must decide whether to go forward with God or go back to the animals where we came from and not make your people feel bad about their God anymore." "You are right," said the old chief. "I will go away until I can decide." He ran with little clothing or supplies up into the foothills until reaching the snowy top of the mountain that we call Mount Spokane. He was the only human being there. He was not cold. He started a fire and sat before it thinking about his God and his son. When he looked down, he saw only the green of many trees. He sat without moving for 3 days, no food, just some snow he drank. He prayed over and over, "Why did you do this, God?" Suddenly a vision came as big as the whole sky and trees together. God's voice was visibly flying across the entire site, saying, "Your son is happy here with me, so you should have faith." The old chief's heart was whole again as he saw his son smiling and sitting next to God. God spoke again, "This world will not go away until people with white flesh come and bring a book with them. This book will have many words about it in me. Do not kill these people, even if they harm you, for there's no use to it." This was all that was spoken, but it inspired the old chief. He had visions as a child, but this truly was the clearest vision of them all. Now he ran down the mountain fast, thinking how happy his people would be to know that God is good. And he wanted very much to tell them everything that God said. The further down the mountain and the closer to the camp, the less sure he was about how his people would understand the part of the vision about the white people. So, by the time he arrived in his camp, he only told them the good news and thought he should wait to tell the rest until some other day. The old chief never told the rest of the story to anyone, but became older and older until almost no one in his camp remembered that he had been a highly respected chief of his tribe. Most of his day was spent sitting in camp by the fire, daydreaming about his youth. I'll just say that, at least by what would be a reasonable chronology, these events, assuming they happened on some basis as reported, would have been probably about 1770, 1780. So that would be the time frame to be thinking about. One day, so now we're quite a few years later. One day in the very midst of the tribal activity, the mountain that we call Mount St. Helens erupted and blew ash into the winds that carried the ash and dumped it on the camp, making it night in the middle of the day. How many of you remember that experience, huh? Well, it's been demonstrated, I think, that the last time Mount St. Helens blew was 1980. I was here, many of you were here. I remember that apocalyptic feeling as the curtain came across the sky. The last time it blew was early in the 19th century. So the time frame is going to be something in the, at least the general time frame that we have in mind here. If this story is accurate as reported, it would be around circa 1815 or so. It dumped ash and it made it night in the middle of the day. This frightened everyone so much that all they could do was jump up and down and scream, "This is the end of the world!" There was a dark confusion all around. The old chief pushed his way up